Hello, everybody. I am Sean Roberts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Fellows Workshop for the 8th Biennial Hamad Bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. I am a co-chair of the symposium and director of art history here at VCU Arts Qatar. In just a moment, my co-chairs will have a bit to say about both the theme of the symposium and also about this new workshop that we're doing as part of it. First, I just wanted to take this opportunity both to welcome you to VCU Arts Qatar and to our campus here, and to say just a few words about our program in art history. The art history program was founded in 2012, and we currently enroll just about 70 undergraduate students, and we've even been a little bit above that last year, I think. So it has been a hugely successful program in terms of student numbers and enrollment here in Doha. Like this symposium, it was designed to take full advantage of Doha's unique location, poised as it is on a crossroads of historical trade routes linking the Indian Ocean, the Central Islamic lands, and the Mediterranean. We represent one of the only programs really in the world that is focused on the history of Islamic art within a global context. And that is something that is, I think, a really exciting point of convergence with this symposium, and it's something that you'll see when you get to meet some of our students over the next couple days who will be attending here in the audience for all of your talks. I invite you tomorrow to read a little bit more about the art history program in the statement that is in the kind of full program that you'll get in the morning. And that's kind of at the back where you have my big picture there and me saying some things about art history here. So you can learn a little bit about our program there. But for now, I just wanted to welcome you, and I'm going to turn things over to the first of my co-chairs, Jochen Sokoli, one of our faculty specialists in Islamic art, who is going to say a few words about how we, about the theme of the symposium and how we settled on that theme. So please welcome Jochen.
Thank you. So the previous symposia have been on specific themes. So we had color, and they were all based somehow also on Quranic quotations. So we had one, the rivers of paradise, for example. One on objects connected to the museum. So for this symposium, we wanted to open up, first of all, the floor. So that was an important aspect. Secondly, we wanted to bring in the location of where we are. And as Sean has already said, with our department and its focus on Islamic art or Islamic culture and in a global context, I think we thought it would make sense to have a conference that would be collaborative, multidisciplinary, and open up avenues. And we are really here at the crossroads between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean world, the continent of Africa and Asia. And so it made sense to look at the connectivity. And of course, the mobility of works, of objects, of people over time. And sort of to look at the dynamics of this interaction and how also, to some extent, bears onto the contemporary world. And of course, you've seen today, you've been to different places, that Doha is a very vibrant place and an extremely international community. I don't know how many nations live here, but how many languages are spoken here, but I would not be surprised if we are well into the 100 region. So the conference really is, in a sense, reflects that. And so I'm very happy that you're here. And I will now turn over to my colleague Radha Dalal, who will talk to you a little bit about the fellows and how we conceived the special fellows meeting.
So I extend my welcome as well, along with Sean's and Joachim's. Qatar Foundation, VCU Arts, and VCU Arts Qatar have sponsored the Hamad Bin Khalifa Travel Fellowship since 2007, when the first cohort of fellows were selected to attend the Rivers of Paradise Symposium held right here in Doha. Since then, the program has fully funded the attendance of more than 90 scholars of Islamic art and culture at varying stages of their career. For this year's symposium, Jochen, Sean, and I decided, in lieu of a traditional keynote address, to introduce an emerging scholars workshop where advanced graduate students and recent postdoctorates would have the opportunity to present new research and engage in dialogue with an exclusive audience of eminent intellectuals in the field. It was a competitive application process with over 50 candidates vying for the 5 fellowships, but ultimately our selections depended on freshness of research and its alignment with the symposium's theme. The first of the 5 fellows is Sarah Keller, currently a junior postdoctorate fellow at the Max Weber Center in Erfurt, Germany. Her research focuses on the theory of architecture on Western India, in particular the port cities of Gujarat. Today she presents Water, a Persian hydraulic technology via Western Indian port towns. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I would like to say that I'm very thankful to be here. I would like to thank not just the co-chair of this panel, but Marisa, all the organizers of this symposium, and express my gratitude to be here and to receive this fellowship and have the opportunity to discover Doha and the wonderful work which is done here at the VCU. I'm going to speak about water, which is not exactly the same title which you saw in the program, so I'm also thankful for the organizer to adapt to this proposal to change a little bit the perspective of my work, though I'm still going to speak about the Western Indian port towns. And actually, it's a very nice transition with today morning, because we finished with water, and now in the afternoon we are starting again with water. Just a word to my institute. I'm working at the Max Weber Center. I have few brochures with me if you are interested. It's a research project which has been funded by the DFG, and it focuses on religion and urbanity. So we are trying to look at cities, religion, and how both this phenomenon have influenced each other. The work which I'm going to present today is also tapping in my survey work which I do in India on Indian architecture and the influence of Islamic designs and influence Islamic technologies in India. And in the framework of this work, there has been several books which has been published on the port towns of Gujarat and Western India. There was a series of conferences, and this was the first book, and this is the latest published book which came out this year on knowledge in the Indian Ocean. So the idea is to look at the port towns of Western India and how the trading activity of this port have facilitated the introduction in India of many more things than just objects and products, but also knowledge, ideas, aesthetics, and a lot of intangible thing which was available on the overseas. To start my presentation, I must say that I'm a brilliant archaeologist, so I work on the history of architecture. And to start, I wanted to show you this small object which I just manufactured today morning. And you're very far, so I don't know if you're able to see what it is. Can you give a guess? I touched a key, but it could be anything. And it's a tool which is used to build in the past, and still today it is used. It is a plumb, exactly, it's a plumb. It's a plumb, and it helps guiding the mason to find a vertical line. And the plumb is the symbol, oh, sorry. That's the symbol of the Western architecture. That's with this tool that people could build cathedrals, and master builders could erect these very tall columns and very straight architecture in Europe. That's the symbol of the standing man. On the other side, in the Persian world, you have the horizontal line, the level. That's the theory which Karagi has developed when he wrote his book, La civilisation des eaux cachées, so the civilization of hidden waters. And for him, the challenge of finding solutions for water in the Persian world and in Central Asia altogether gave the opportunity to Persian architects to develop more techniques and facilities to find the level. And the whole architecture of the Persian world, if you see, is very much derived from this knowledge on finding a level, which is a very different technology like the plumb, because for the plumb you just need gravity, and for a level you need a little bit more of geometry and technical and engineering knowledge. So this all knowledge about leveling, about managing water was not available in India in the early days, and it has been introduced in the later period through the sea and through the maritime route, and that's what I'm going to talk to you today. You have here a map which you already know. And I'm going to talk about the port towns of Western India, mostly Khambat, Surat, and Bharuch, which is not here, but we'll see it very soon. And these port towns have been linked with the Arabian Peninsula since the earlier days. Actually, we have evidences of connection here in the Bronze period already. We have Indian artifacts in the Gulf in the Bronze period, and we have Indian merchants active in Siraf and then in Hormuz throughout the medieval and modern period. And the same way around, you also find lots of Arabic communities in the port towns of Gujarat. This travel between the Persian Gulf and Gujarat has been a very important trade route, not just because it was of the interest of merchants of both sides of the ocean, but because also it is a very easy and quite smooth travel to cross the Arabian Sea at this level. You just follow the wind, and it's quite simpler and much safer than to travel through the Himalayan passes and the entire Central Asia. Actually, if you start from Surat and you want to reach Hormuz, it just takes 14 to 15 days, which is much quicker than the weeks which you need if you want to cross here through the land road. So this is a map which is showing the most important port towns of Gujarat. Bharuch, this is the old Baru Gaza of the antique references, and it was the main port during the earlier days. In a later period, the merchants and the trading communities shifted to Khambat because the port of Bharuch got silted. And after a few centuries, the entire life of Khambat again traveled to Surat because the port of Khambat also got silted. So you have here in the Gulf of Khambat a series of leading ports which were of great importance at their own period. And they show that it's not just the port towns and the building which is important, but it's actually the people and the spirit which has traveled from one place to another. Surat was the important port in the 17th century, and after British came in the scene, the merchant traveled to Bombay, and that is the reason why Bombay is such a huge, important town today, because it is inheriting this whole spirit of the trade and the merchant trading communities of Gujarat. This is an engraving of the port of Bharuch, the old Baru Gaza. It shows the city wall, and the water which was reaching the wall. And this is a picture which we took some 3-4 years back. You can recognize the long city wall here. And you can see that the water has gone very far on the right side. The Narmada is now approximately 1 kilometer away. And that's just wanted to show you this picture to make you understand this silting and this tragedy of the Indian port towns, and at the same time, it reflects on the capacity of the people in Gujarat to find new solutions and start again over and over and overcoming their difficulties. In the 17th century, the port towns of Gujarat were not just places of trade, but because they had this huge amount of flow of ships in the Arabian Sea, they also became very important port towns for the exchange of knowledge, culture, and for religious purpose. Surat was the Babal Mecca of India. That was the starting point for all the pilgrims who wanted to go to Mecca. And here it is a representation, a miniature painting from the 17th century, where you see a representation of the port towns, and here the ship loaded with pilgrims who were traveling to Mecca. And we know that one ship was taking some 400 people, so you can imagine the amount of people who were crossing the sea at that time. And we speak about mobility today, but they were also traveling a lot. And not just rich merchant or courtier, but it was a common thing to cross the sea and to go to Mecca. So in the course of this huge flow of people, of information in the sea, there was also a lot of knowledge who came in Gujarat. In the 15th century, the Sultan of Gujarat became big patron of the arts and of culture, and they gave lots of grants for students. They paid calligraphers to come in Gujarat to enrich the libraries. And this is a reconstruction model of one of the important madrasa of Ahmedabad at that time. Ahmedabad was the capital of Gujarat. This was in the late 16th century. Shavajiuddin was one of the important scholars of the capital, and after his death, some 15 years after his death, a mausoleum was built over his tomb. And again, 10 years after that, a new madrasa was built where he was teaching. And the person who sponsored this madrasa, his name was Sadiq Khan. He was a courtier from Khorasan. So he did not just put money into it, but he brought in people from Khorasan to build this madrasa, which was something very new because India was having a very rich architectural tradition. And till now, the sultans of Gujarat were tapping into the knowledge stock of the architectural tradition of Gujarat. And this was a very new thing that they were bringing people from outside and thus bringing new aesthetics in India. This is here an axonometric view of the same site as it is today. You can recognize there's a mausoleum here. It's a stone building built according to the traditional architecture of Gujarat. The prayer hall, which was built later, slightly after the madrasa, so that's why it was not there in the reconstruction model of the previous site. And here the remains of the wall of the madrasa. And here, on the south side of the mausoleum, you see this huge structure, which is actually an underground structure, so you don't see it when you walk in the courtyard. It's having two rooms. There's one southern room, which I'm not going to speak about it today because it's another issue, but we are going to speak about this huge room here, which is a cistern. And that's how it looks. And for those who have already visited cistern in the Mediterranean area, they would certainly find this very familiar. Maybe you have been in Istanbul, you have seen the Basilica cistern in Istanbul. So it gives this huge, the same impression of monumentality because of the height of the wall. It's about 6 meters high, the size of the room itself, the big pillars. Here you have a plan of the cistern, which is approximately 13 by 14 meters, having 8 pillars. And it's a quite gigantic room. It's also very different from other structures which were already existing in Gujarat and which were designed for water. This is an example from the late 11th century, the tank of the Surya temple near Patan, one of the iconic example of water structures in Gujarat, but you find all over lots of similar structures. They are huge tank, open to air, and they have all these steps to allow the people to access the water. So you can see the huge difference in the architecture. This is built in stone. The previous system which I showed you was built in brick. Here it's heavily carved with a lot of sculptural work. And the main difference is that it is, this one is open and the system is closed. Here are a few more examples of similar other water structures of Gujarat which were built before the arrival of this underground system. If you look at the cut section of the madrasa, you can recognize here the mausoleum, the old remains of the wall of the madrasa, and here the courtyard, and below the courtyard this huge room which serves as a cistern and its southern chamber. So now if we look into detail of this whole entire construction, we can see that the leveling of the place has been made with a great attention to the level, because the water which falls in the courtyard would flow down and enter in the cistern through these jallis, this screen lattice, and fill the cistern. So from this cut section, you can understand that the entire courtyard has not just been made by coincidence, but it has been leveled and it has been made with a lot of knowledge and engineering knowledge which allow the entire site to be used as a catchment area for this system. This is a picture of this jalli, this screen lattice, which allows the water to enter in the cistern. It's having a stone carving inside. And what is very interesting, it is having this high border, which would allow the particles, the sand, and the dust to settle here, and only the fresh water, which is overflowing, would enter in the cistern. So that's also a small detail that shows that people were very much aware about the importance of leveling and hygiene. This cistern of the Shavajiuddin mausoleum was a prototype, practically, in Ahmedabad, and after this model was introduced, many other systems were built in the city. That's another axonometric view of a typical model of the tanka as it is found today. Actually, if you walk in the street in the old walled city of Ahmedabad, you will see a lot of housing having this system. It became a very common system, and all the people were building their own private tanka in the 17th century. They all have the same features. They all measure 15 by 30 feet. They all have these 3 arches. They are built in brick. They are coated with chunam, which is local lime wash. And just a word to this lime wash, this is also part of this geniusity of this technology, because there was a study in 2004 by a group of engineers, Hakim Ali and his team, and they found out that the enclosure of the water plus the use of this particular lime wash was allowing people to keep clean water throughout the year. That means that they were storing water here in the tank during rainy season, and till the next year, they could keep clean water. He actually compared the quality of this water with the tap water which was supplied by the municipality of Ahmedabad at that time, and the water from the old tanker was cleaner and having a better quality than the new modern, so-called modern water. So after these studies, actually, it was a great encouragement for people to restore the tankers and eventually come back to these old techniques. It also has one opening here. It's the single opening of the entire structure, and it's necessary for a bucket, of course, to go down and pour water, but it's also useful for a tiny person or a not too fat labor to enter in the cistern and clean the entire place, because it has to be cleaned and lime washed at least once in a year before the monsoon to be sure that it is effective and that this lime wash continues to kill the microorganism and to keep the water clean. I think the time might be over, so I'll just stop here. Yeah? Thank you.
So I'd like to just briefly introduce our next presenter, Holly Ledbetter, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and who's going to talk about a very interesting subject, namely the Viking afterlives of Samanid silver. So we're looking forward to it.
Thank you first to Marissa for everything that you've done in terms of coordinating this conference. Corresponding with you is a breeze, and I really appreciate your help. Okay. While medieval cultural encounters have received ample attention in the last decade, scholarly focus has centered around Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade, leaving the rich trade routes of Central Asia comparatively understudied. Investigating material exchanges between the Samanids, a Persian-speaking dynasty in the Eastern Islamic world, and the Vikings along the Volga River in the 10th century, I trace the ways Viking adaptations of Samanid wares imbue Samanid silver with new meanings. I will begin first with an exploration of how trade was facilitated between the Vikings and Samanids before outlining the various goods traded in these exchanges. I will then highlight a series of material translations wherein Viking subjects repurposed Samanid silver and resituated these objects in new contexts with new meanings. From a study of these diverse surviving objects, an afterlife of Samanid materials emerges, revealing vibrant cultural contact along the forgotten river routes of Central Asia and the ways meaning is constructed along the nexus of contact. This essay offers a corrective of sorts to the recent developments in the narrative of encounter between these two groups. Namely, on the one hand, that Vikings had an uneasy relationship with the Eastern Islamic world, as often peddled by contemporary white nationalists who actively co-opt Viking symbols for their own racist agendas. In addition to, on the other hand, the story that broke late 2017, where Uppsala University archaeology professor Annika Larsson claimed to have uncovered a Viking textile that included an Arabic inscription with the names of Allah and Ali in Kufic script. Based on the discovery, Larsson argued the textile's inscription demonstrated not only contact between the Vikings and the Islamic world, but also that Islamic practices influenced Viking burial customs. Associate Professor of Islamic Art at the University of Texas, Stephanie Mulder, took to Twitter to debunk these claims almost immediately, highlighting that while there was in fact contact between the Vikings and the Islamic world, this textile isn't an example of such contact. In fact, it contains no Arabic at all, but rather a simple woven band of geometric patterns. In her Twitter thread, Mulder emphasizes the work of the late Melanie Michaelides, who has argued that Samanid motifs may very well have inspired Viking decorative patterns, citing the yelling cup and the mammon axe, as evidence for Viking Samanid trade. The work I present here today, then, attempts to shed light on the larger debate regarding Viking contact with the Islamic world, especially in terms of Islamic practices influencing Viking burial customs and the particular ways Vikings repurposed Samanid wares. The geographic focus of the material encounter between the Vikings and the Samanids falls along the Volga River, the longest and largest river moving south from Lake Ladoga, bordering Finland, to the mouth of the Caspian Sea. The Muslim merchants who facilitated and participated in trade along the Volga were Samanids, hailing from a dynasty that emerged first as an extension of the Abbasid Caliphate in nearby Baghdad, and subsequently as de facto rulers of the empire's eastern frontier, eventually even minting coins in their own name. The Volga River enabled an immense volume of trade along what is today called the Fur Route, a major trade network between Central Asia and Northeastern Europe by the 10th century. This particular lesser-known trade route is intriguing for its evidence of cultural exchange, as well as its far-reaching implications for the cultural transmission of ideas and objects from Samanid Central Asia to the Viking world. Samanids prized Viking commodities and vice versa. Samanid merchants traded their own silver, glass, both Abbasid and Samanid coins, and textiles in exchange for furs, wood, amber, and honey from the Norse. Slaves, too, were unfortunately among the most traded commodities of the Viking-Samanid exchange, with Samanid merchants collecting slaves along the Volga and recirculating them back to Abbasid territories. Remnants of the treasured commodities received by the Samanids in the exchange rarely survive beyond documentary accounts preserved in medieval Arabic sources, and even those are scant. Conversely, however, the Samanid silver, glass, coins, and textile wares valued by the Vikings have in fact survived in burial mounds and hoards and are still preserved in museum and private collections today. These once Samanid objects, however, undergo extreme material transformations in their new Viking context. The reuse and alteration of foreign objects in a Viking context is evinced by various archaeological finds and the holdings of museum collections. Instances of reuse are sometimes economic in their conception, like the Viking reuse of silver fir wood barrels from the Rhineland as wells, while other examples of reuse are more conceptual. In addition to reusing foreign materials due to economic considerations, repurposed objects were also used in the Viking Age to purposefully display the wealth and status of their owners. Women especially often wore repurposed accessories to indicate the social positions of their husband and family. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab ambassador to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, who kept a diary of his interactions with the Vikings, recalls how the number of torques around a Viking woman's neck seemingly indicated the wealth of her husband. He notes that, quote, all their women wear on their bosoms a circular brooch made of iron, silver, copper, or gold, depending on their husband's wealth and social position, end quote. That all women, according to Ibn Fadlan, are adorned with some type of metal jewelry indicates the demand of these materials and underscores the necessity of trade between the Vikings and Samanids, since Vikings had no access to silver mines in their own territories. Therefore, trading furs and slaves for silver of any kind, in the form of raw coins or the material itself, with the Samanids of Central Asia, would have been appealing and likely socially necessary for the Vikings. Ibn Fadlan continues, quote, round their necks, the wives wear torques of gold and silver, for every man, as soon as he accumulates 10,000, has a torque made for his wife. When he has 20,000, he has 2 torques made, and so on. Every time he increases his fortune by 10,000, he adds another torque to those his wife already possesses, so that one woman may have many torques round her neck, end quote. In fact, Viking period silver jewelry, excavated most often from the graves of women, is the most attested form of reconstituted Islamic coins and artifacts in Viking contexts. Islamic coins were often modified by adding clasps on the back so they could be worn as brooches, or were pierced or fitted with a loop to be incorporated into a necklace or arm bracelet. Surviving examples reveal that sometimes coins were altered, folded around additional silver rings, or attached to other silver objects. Samanid silver dirhams, for example, were especially altered and subsequently reused, at least in Viking burial contexts, as necklaces, arm and neck bands, pendants, and rings. Additionally, some extant examples of Islamic dirhams have added graffiti bearing a striking resemblance to Thor's hammer, a popular motif often repeated in Viking Age jewelry and metal wares. Graffiti is a particularly tricky alteration to assess, especially in terms of dating the modifications and identifying the actors responsible for them. However, the amuletic function of this motif, pervasive throughout Viking contexts, is important to note and can provide useful context for the reuse of Islamic portable objects such as coins. Scholars like Neil Price have suggested that Vikings often signaled their supernatural allegiances to others and to themselves with a variety of personal amulets, presumably desirous of protection from deities and other spiritual beings. Therefore, because Islamic coins in the form of necklaces, like this one, are so abundant and often found in grave contexts like other amulets crafted in the Viking world, these small objects exported from afar were likely co-opted and used as portable amulets, capable of indicating simultaneously social status, wealth, and even group or singular spiritual proclivities. The exotic nature of the Arabic script on Islamic coins and the rarity of the silver material from which they are struck would have been appealing to a Viking who wished to exhibit his or her social standing and cosmopolitan identity. This particularly interesting necklace, found in a female burial in Finland, includes dirhams used as hanging ornaments strung from a series of ceramic beads. The Arabic inscriptions on the dirhams are composed of the Shahada, the most typical inscription to appear on Islamic coinage. The Arabic Shahada is the Islamic testimony of the oneness of God and the acceptance of Muhammad as the prophet of God. It is unlikely that a Viking wearer of this necklace could decipher this inscription. Therefore, they knew not what they embraced, but the object must have retained some element of power, protection, and prestige for their new Viking owners based on their abundance in Viking Age jewelry finds of the modern period. Indeed, there are also extant examples of imitation dirhams with pseudo-Kufic writing produced in Scandinavia during the Viking period, which further highlights Viking interest in the Arabic script. The burial context in which these repurposed Islamic items such as this necklace are found provides an indication of possible amuletic function. From Icelandic sagas, Old Norse poetry, and other burial accounts, the particular items found in Viking burials, grave goods as they're called, are given added significance as markers of status, identity, as well as belief systems. Icelandic sagas connect grave goods with the soul's ability to prosper in the afterlife. For example, a passage from Yngling saga relates how Odin, quote, ordered that all the dead were to be burned on a pyre together with their possessions, saying that everyone would arrive in Valhalla with such wealth as he had with him on his pyre, and that he would also enjoy the use of what he himself had hidden in the ground, end quote. A Viking must therefore be buried with his sword, wartime embellishments he acquired from the enemies during his lifetime, as well as other treasured possessions like personal amulets and bodily accessories. Without doubt, male warriors were given arm rings and torques from their superiors as payments for services. That these necklaces and other forms of jewelry are found in graves speaks to their significance in Viking culture as a personal go-with-me type object. Indeed, a necklace's proximity to the body also points to an amuletic function, since most Viking amulets are known to have been worn around the neck, attached to the hip, or on the wrist or ankle, just as the reconstituted Islamic coin necklaces were. Placed on the deceased during burial, the Viking body bears the necklace throughout his or her afterlife, underscoring a desire for the eternal protection granted to its wearer. In the 10th century, most Vikings were still pagans or recently converted Christians that maintained many of their pagan beliefs. In other words, they believed in many gods, so the reuse of Arabic inscribed coins that indicate the oneness of God in the Islamic faith is at odds with their own belief systems, which highlights that the wearers of these reconstituted Abbasid and Samanid coins were unlikely to have understood these inscriptions, but instead valued the accessories for their material value or their exotic nature. The shape of the Arabic letters, for example, would have been strikingly different than runic. All in all, Vikings seemingly prized all forms of silver in the form of both coins and as raw materials, as markers of social status for the living and useful objects in the afterlife for the deceased. They traded their own commodities for silver extensively with the Samanids, using primarily the Volga River as a nexus for trade. Likely to accommodate the new Viking demand for silver during this period of increased exchange along the Volga, the Samanids exhausted 2 silver mines in their own territories over the course of the century. Instead of using Abbasid and Samanid coins as a form of currency, Vikings repurposed these materials in particular ways that shed light on Viking self-fashioning practices, in addition to phenomena related to the Viking afterlife, lending to these objects new functions and new meanings that depart from their original Samanid conceptualizations. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to welcome our third speaker this afternoon. Rita Mooney is a fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University currently. He received his PhD at the Sorbonne in 2011 and is a specialist in the arts of Tunisia and more broadly in the artistic material transformations of the Maghreb. He's held a number of prestigious postdoctoral fellowships, including at the French Academy in Rome at Villa Medici, which I am, as always, particularly jealous of. So please join me in welcoming Rita Mooney.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me, and it's such a pleasure to be among such relevant and brilliant people. I'm going to, and thank you for the organizers and for such a warm welcome also. So I'm going to talk today, present briefly and quickly in 15 minutes work I'm dealing with over the last 3-4 years. It's a project, it was a curatorial project that became also, which was a research project and became also in a larger scale a research project about the development of the painting in the Kingdom of Tunisia in the 19th century and also in the early 20th century. I'm going to speak very briefly about an important moment in this history of exchange, of artistic exchange in the Mediterranean in the middle of the 19th century, and an important moment in my study, which is the travel of Ahmed Bey that you see here on your left in Paris in 1846. I'm sorry, I didn't put the date, but the title was so long, so I preferred not to put anything. So this is the frame of my study. As you can see in the middle of the southern shores of the Mediterranean, you have Tunis here. And this map has been made in France in 1830. And 1830 is the year in which Algiers was taken by the French army and led to an important transformation of the Mediterranean, especially in the southern shores. Tunisia, which was a province of the Ottoman Empire for almost 2.5 centuries, became a neighbor to the French Empire and still a province of the Ottoman looking for their sovereignty during the 19th century. We don't have a lot of documents, we don't have a lot of testimonies, and also archival source about the history of the painting of Tunisia, but the representations of Tunisians among the history in the 18th and 19th century are present in major European and American museums through the representation of mainly ambassadors, such as these Tunisian ambassadors sent in London around 1780, or other kind of ambassadors, such as Souleymane Ara. Maybe you are familiar with this portrait on the left because it has been displayed recently at the Metropolitan Museum and at Versailles for the exhibition Versailles and the World, but also the portrait of Mustafa, who was a Tunisian seller that became working for Théodore Géricault after he found him in the street of Paris, where he said he was abandoned after the capture of his ship. 1830 is the year in which Tunisia made a very important diplomatic agreement with France after the end of the Coastline activities. And this political relationship from 1830 became very rich for the Tunisian kingdom. The next decades, the next 2 decades, will see a lot of employees coming from France to Tunis. Among them, le Duc de Montpensier, the youngest son of Louis-Philippe, King of France, who came to Tunis to visit the Bay of Tunis, the new neighbor of France, because as I said, Algeria became French from 1830, and the conquest of Algeria finished in the middle of the 1840s. So le Duc de Montpensier and other members of the royal court started coming to Tunis. And with this exchange started also exchange of portraiture. Here is a copy of a painting made by Winter Alter, a copy sent to the Bay of Tunis probably around 1842. And here you have a portrait sent to the Bay of Tunis after the visit of the Duc de Montpensier that he made in 1846. Some accounts, traveler accounts, speak about the presence of paintings in the court of Tunis at that time. Some of them talk about the presence of Ottoman portraits, old Ottoman portraits, probably from the 16th or 17th century, sent to Tunis at that time, which were present in the royal palace of the Bardo. Some other people were talking also about the presence of the portraits of French kings, which was a little bit problematic, especially for Tunisian ulama and sheikh, which saw the reproduction of Western kings' portraits in the royal palace as very problematic and close to idolatry. As we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to show you the texts related to these findings. But when le Duc de Montpensier came to Tunis, there was this exchange of gifts. The Duc de Montpensier later sent this portrait to the Bey of Tunis, where you can see the youngest son of the King of France, with the decoration, Tunisian decoration of Nishan at them. He wanted to show as a remember of his visit that he received this prestigious gift, which is a medal made in diamond by the Bey of Tunis, who gave him also this very prestigious saddle made with gold, which is now currently on display in the Musée Condé in France. At that time, the Bey of Tunis decided to visit the King of France in Paris in 1846. The purpose of this trip was diplomatic. He wanted to have security from the French king that he will protect him if he gets his autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. This trip was planned in November 1846. And before leaving from Tunis, the Bey of Tunis was represented in the first portrait known of the king by a French architect living in Tunisia, in a French newspaper at that time, L'Illustration. Here you've got this very so-called Oriental portrait of the Bey. You see his profile, you see this, the throne of the Bey, which is a very particular throne. And here you got medals celebrating this visit. The Bey leaves Tunisia in November 1846. He will stay in Paris 2 months. He will have a royal welcome from the King of France, and he will visit different monuments, including the Louvre Museum, Versailles, and he will visit also l'Artillerie, l'Arsenal, and he will be really impressed by the accomplishment of the French civilization, as they used to say in Paris. In the account of his travel, among them the chronics of Emne Bidieff, a Tunisian minister, and also chroniclers who went with him, the Bey was amazed by this French civilization. But also what is very interesting for my study is, for the first time, a king of Tunisia left Tunisia and was interacted and was in contact with the Western culture. In Paris, he lived in Paris and stayed in Paris during 2 months. He visited also different monuments and met some painters. He was a sitter for Charles Philippe Larivière, who made this portrait of Ahmed Bey, 2 copies of the portrait. Larivière was known also because he made, at that time, the same moment, the portrait of the Viceroy d'Egypte, Ibrahim Besha. But what is interesting in my case is he did this portrait, 2 copies of this portrait, one kept by the King of France, Louis Philippe, and another one the Bey brought back with him. And this portrait will be very important in the history of painting and the royal painting, in the painting in the royal court of Tunisia. Among the suite and the court members who came with Ahmed Bey, there was Mahmoud Ben Hayed that you see on the left, and also Giuseppe Raffo you see here on the right. This is the first Minister of Foreign Office of Tunisia. Giuseppe Raffo was the uncle also of the Bey of Tunis because his mother was Italian. And they both also commissioned a painting from Charles Gleyre. Charles Gleyre was very known at that moment. He had a very important studio in Paris and was sometime commissioned by Louis Philippe and the King of France himself. This portrait is now conserved in Tunisia. We put it on display in a show about 4 years ago. It's one of the most amazing and monumental portraits that Charles Gleyre made, where you see an amazing panorama of Tunis behind the minister. The painter Charles Gleyre never went to Tunis, but probably my theory is the same architect who drew the profile of Ahmed Bey in 1846 sent plans of the city of Tunis, because this is a really realistic topography view of Tunis to Charles Gleyre, who was his friend. They are both from Switzerland. And he reproduced this beautiful panorama with the old minaret of the Zitouna Mosque that you see here, in this portrait of this monumental portrait of Giuseppe Raffo. This one, the portrait of Mahmoud Ben Ayed, unfortunately, it's lost. Last time put on display, I think, around 1910 or 20. I think probably it's still conserved in the storage of the national collections of Tunisia. It's published in the 1370s under as a work by Delacroix, but I don't think it's not a work of Delacroix, and it's obviously a work by Charles Gleyre, who was commissioned these two portraits, but also this portrait, which is one of the most beautiful representation of Ahmed Bey. So during this trip in France, Ahmed Bey was interacting a lot with local painters, French painters, and was represented several times. This portrait is much more intimist than the other one. He's wearing a civil costume. He has all his medals. These medals are very important. You will see why. And these portraits were brought back with him to Tunis. The King of France also gave him several important pieces of furniture coming from Sèvres. Some of them are now conserved in the Louvre Museum, such as the Guéridon des Vues de Bord de Seine, which was a real royal gift, absolutely magnificent. And the other gift, which is probably the most precious that we have in the national collections of Tunisia, and we discovered recently, is the tapestry representing Louis-Philippe, which is after a portrait of Hersan, which is the only portrait which is the only tapestry made in the manufacture of the Gobelins, still conserved, representing Louis-Philippe, still conserved. In exchange of gifts representing the material culture produced in Tunisia at that time, the Bey of Tunis mainly gave this object. Medals made in diamonds that cost a lot to the Tunisian state. During his trip from Tunis to Paris, the Bey of Tunis arrived to Toulon. He did a journey from Toulon, the port of Toulon, to Paris, and he was giving basically these medals all with his name, Ahmed Bey, all over to many people, and it cost a lot of money, as I said. But this was also a symbol of Tunisian sovereignty, because Tunisia at that time was the only regency of the Ottoman Empire that produced their own midland, and it was a symbol of independence from the Ottoman Empire. Here you have the representation of, I showed you, of the Bey, with this throne made in the 18th century and carved in whale bones, still on display in Tunisia. It only lost the central motif. And when he came back from Paris, he also, the Bey, brought back with him this very interesting and eclectic throne with different styles, where you see the crescent and the star symbol, that it was commissioned by a Muslim king. And this throne will be the throne of the Bey of Tunisia from 1846 to 1957, and the end of the monarchy in Tunisia. When he was in Paris, what is interesting is the Bey of Tunis started also in the process of exchanging portraits with French dignitaries. He started asking, this is an archive from the National Archives in Tunisia, he started asking also to the people he admired and met when he was in Paris, portrait to keep it as souvenir of the people he met. And this is one of the portrait he asked from the Duc d'Almaty, who was one of the main generals of Napoleon. And as the Bey was an important admirator, like a lot of Arab kings at that time, of Napoleon, when he met him, he wanted to keep a souvenir of him. Few years later, the Bey of Tunis, his successor, Mohammed Bey, will adopt a series of reform, because Tunisia was going through a series of important reform coming after the Tanzimat in Turkey. And in 1857, they adopt this very important law text called Ahd al-Aman that established a lot of important reform, including the abolition of slavery, the freedom of worship for minorities, etc. And they did this ceremony with the shuyukh and ulama, and here you see a priest next to them, in this room in the royal court, in the reception room of the Bardo, where you see the portrait of the Bey of Tunis that he brought back from Tunis at that time. And here what is interesting is in 1856, which means 12 years after this trip to Paris, we have the first painting signed by a Tunisian painter called Mohamed de Joudeli, which is the exact same reproduction of this portrait by Larivière. The only difference is the Bey of Tunis has less gray hairs in his beard, and he has one extra medal in order to give more prestige to this portrait. This portrait became very important and reproduced in many, many reproductions that you can find in private collections where part of my research focused on. And here what is interesting is you have the portrait in a ceremonial outfit, and just right next to it, the symbol, the new symbol of power, which is this material culture brought back from France. In other engravings of this ceremony, what is interesting is you can see in the Royal Palace many, many paintings on displays on the wall. Not a lot of them are known. I'm still trying to document. I was able to find some of them which are located here. And what is interesting is at that moment, after this travel to France, there is a craze for this new portraiture in representation of the dignitaries of the Tunisian, of different Tunisian dignitaries, including the Mamluks. This is a very well-known portrait of the General Khaireddin, who will become later the Prime Minister. And here is a reproduction, a representation of a Husseini prince. What is interesting is to see the adoption properly of the European goods in the Tunisian interiors. You see here the reproduction of nudity in this piece of furniture, probably commissioned in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. Here you've got a carpet coming probably from Aubusson or Nîmes, and except for the fez and maybe not the moustache, everything looks like to a portrait of a Parisian or French general of army. The way they represented themselves and the way they tried to copy also the French representation is the way to inscribe this new aristocracy into a modernity. But what is really interesting is a few years later, Ahmed Bey, Sadaq Bey, who became the new Bey in 1859, pursued also the series of reform and started since 1859, so the year he arrives into power, started being represented as a garant of the policy of Ahmed Bey, which is here in this portrait, and also here through this legal text. And what is very interesting is the adoption of the portrait. This is the first royal portrait made in Tunisia by a painter called Louis Simil, probably coming from Malta. And this portrait will be exchanged by Sadaq Bey himself with the American government. And that's why it's now displayed in Washington, D.C. in exchange of another portrait. I will not go into talk about this portraiture and the development of the portrait in Tunis, but show you also, a few years later, in 1861, is adopted the first constitution in the Arab world in Tunisia, a constitution that stipulates in motion only once the Quran. And this is the royal portrait that at that time Sadaq Bey commissioned to a painter called Monnier, French painter living in Tunisia. And you can see the assimilation and resemblance to the portrait of Winterhalter representing Napoleon III. It's exactly the same gesture. The only difference is the Bey is putting his hand on this new constitution, a legal text that shows the continuity of the Tunisian monarchy through the new adopted laws. But what is interesting also is to see all these elements with Tunisian symbolic, but also coming from France, such as the throne, and also all these medals that show a new symbolic of the Tunisian monarchy. This gesture of protection of the constitution will be reproduced in many engravings of their time. It will be also mentioned by Tunisian chroniclers as a very fundamental gest in Tunisia and the Tunisian government. And it will be in display here. It will take part here in the Bardo, in the new Bardo reception room, where you see all these portraits of foreign monarchs that show that Tunisia at that time were not taking their sovereignty from a political perspective, but from an artistic perspective, showing the links established from the Bay of Tunis with all these European monarchs and not with Ottoman monarchs anymore. I'm sorry I took a little bit of time, but thank you for your attention.
Next up is Jennifer Peruski, a doctoral student in Harvard University's History of Art and Architecture department. Jenny researches Islamic artistic practice in Eastern Africa, specifically Swahili material culture, mobility, and the politics of display. The title of her presentation is Portal Patinas, Reconsidering Practices of Collection and Display in 3 Carved Doors from Zanzibar. A warm welcome to Jenny.
Thanks so much for having me here today, and thank you so much to all of the organizers of this symposium. I'm really excited to be here. So what I'm going to be presenting on today are kind of an object type carved doors used in Eastern Africa. And what I'm working against is the dominant framing of them in academic discourses as exclusively visual objects from which individual motifs can be traced through their so-called ethnic origins, and instead kind of working through ideas of regimes of value associated with these doors. And so I'll begin with a curious carved door, now affixed to the back of the Peace Memorial Museum in Zanzibar, with an inscription dating it to 112 after Hijra, or 1700-1701 Common Era. And that date can be found, okay, so here's the inscription, and the date is really right at the base here. I don't know if that's quite legible, but it's 1112. And this date makes it the oldest dated extant door used in Eastern Africa known. The inscription is a slightly amalgamated Quranic phrase from the Surah Asaf, reading Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Nasrun min Allahi wa Fathun Qaribun, which translates as, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, victory from God and imminent conquest. Surrounding the central inscription, the door has been dramatically elaborated with chain link motifs on the inner frame, outer frame, and lintel, various floriated scrolls, including lotuses and peonies, scalloped patterns, and abstracted trees. And so you can see some of that, the abstracted trees here and here at the base, and then chain link motifs along here, various peony forms and lotus scrolls, as well as scalloped patterns here and here, as well as here. The symmetrical design creates a complex web of imagery, guiding the viewer's eyes across the many registers of the frame. The inscription is a focal point, directing us to a chapter from the Quran calling on believers to fight in God's name and spread his word. This short passage inscribed here is particularly focused on conquest and victory, perhaps unintentionally hinting at the imperial or colonial shifts that this door has metaphorically and literally framed. While the door is now affixed to the Peace Memorial Museum in Zanzibar, seen here, a British colonial institution founded in 1925, the circumstances surrounding the door's original production and consumption are unknown. Conservationist Esmond Bradley Martin was the first to publish its prior location as that of Busaidi Sultan Said's palace in Kidichi in rural Zanzibar, which is now destroyed. The Kidichi Palace was built sometime between 1832 and 1850 for one of the wives of Sultan Said. Of course, even 1832 postdates the inscription date by more than 100 years. Where it was located prior to Kidichi remains obscure, but it is interesting to note that this door has been reused at least twice and has transcended 3 different periods of rule in Zanzibar. And so to give you a little bit of a sense of those dynastic shifts, although this is really oversimplified because there's a lot of overlapping of dynasties that's going on the Swahili coast. Omani Mazrui leaders took control of East Africa from the Portuguese by 1698 when they captured Fort Jesus in Mombasa. Mombasa then became the capital of the Mazrui dynasty, from which they administered much of the Swahili coast. During this time, the Mazrui sultans governed Zanzibar through a series of liwalis, or governors, and it was during the 18th century that Mji Mkongwe, or Stone Town, was established as the capital of Zanzibar. And so these are kind of those main 2 cities, Mombasa in the north, and Mji Mkongwe, or Stone Town, on the island of Zanzibar in the south. The door was built early on in the Mazrui period, so it is conceivable that it was commissioned for one of the first structures built by the Mazrui liwalis. Though purely speculative, it could have been made for the old fort in Zanzibar, on which construction began in 1699. Of course, this information is no longer known, but clearly this door and others like it were used from the outset by Masrui rulers. And so I'm just going to return to this because I'm kind of talking through some of the dynastic shifts still so that it's there as a reference point. At some point between 1832 and 1850, it was moved to Sultan Said's palace in Kidichi. Said bin Sultan gained control of Oman in 1806, and over the next several decades expanded his territory into East Africa, wresting Zanzibar and Mombasa from the Masrui dynasty. With the change of leadership from Masrui to Busaidi in the first quarter of the 19th century, lavish symbols of empire, such as carved doors, were relocated to explicitly Busaidi contexts. This carved door remained a powerful symbol of state, which appropriated Masrui claims to Zanzibar. From the Kidichi Palace, the door was moved to the Peace Memorial Museum in Mji Mkongwe sometime before the museum's 1925 opening. This museum is the subject of a rich study by Sarah Longair, in which she demonstrates how museums can be read as analogies to empire. British curators and colonial officials in Zanzibar use the Peace Memorial Museum in various capacities to communicate with and about the local populations. The relocation of this door to an explicitly British colonial institution can thus easily be read into a broader narrative of imperial spoliation. The appropriation of Busaidi and formerly Masrui symbols of wealth and authority fits well within the British colonial mission in Zanzibar. This door, and countless others like it, challenges the way we typically perceive architectural elements because of how mobile it has been. It carries clear histories of use through its display at the Palace in Kidichi and the Peace Memorial Museum in Stonetown, as well as more obscure histories, and that we don't know where it was or how it functioned prior to the mid-19th century. This competing absence and presence of information about this door is a common issue for historians of East African material cultures, and especially for historians who work with carved doors, because so many of these architectural objects have been removed from their previous locations without any record of when, where, or for whom they were made. This raises countless questions about methodology in the field of art history, not the least of which are, what histories are we capable of telling about these objects, and what histories are we obscuring? How can we highlight archival absences beyond simply saying that there is an absence in the record? In working through these questions, what becomes clear is that regardless of regime changes from Masrui to Busaidi to British colonial, that these doors remain deeply imbricated in local and global value systems that were predicated on the control of wealth, people, and knowledge. Indeed, any regime of value necessitates a regime of exclusion or violence. Doors very literally manifest this exclusion by physically closing off access to specific monuments or residences, and more figuratively through local histories of violence attached to construction, which I'll explore a bit more later on. As I will demonstrate through this door, as well as two others attached to Busaidi Sultan Bargash's Beit al-Ajaib, seen here, and Hamad bin Muhammad al-Morjabi's or Tipu Tip's residence in Stonetown, seen here, is that carved doors on the Swahili coast have the incredible capacity to transcend the particular moments in which they were made through ongoing reuse and visual dialogues, and that they have also been consistently used as ethnographic markers of authority, and that these two concepts, value and violence, are irrevocably linked. So now turning more fully to these two doors, I want to further explore this idea of value systems through relational aesthetics. At first glance, these doors do, At first glance, these doors do not appear to share much in common. Sultan Bargash's door on the right is massive compared to Tipu Tip's, although photography does little to actually demonstrate this. And while Bargash's door employs prominent royal imagery in the form of two facing lions, Tipu Tip's relies more heavily on vegetal motifs and inscriptions. But on closer look, the two share a curious amount in common. In addition to the arched lintel surmounted by a rounded finial, the vegetal scroll in both lintels relies on a central pineapple-like motif, here outlined in green, from which radiates both lintels' patterns. Tipu Tip's pineapple motif is modified by a small section of mirrored calligraphy, which I have been unable to read, although would welcome suggestions, and above which is featured the date of the production of the door, which is 1309 after Hijra, or 1891-1892 Common Era. While in contrast, Bargash's pineapple motif has been duplicated. One version is featured between the two facing lions, where the body of the pineapple has been replaced with a blank circular medallion. The second is featured in the finial. Additionally, the vegetal scrolls of both lintels are elaborated with cone-shaped fruits, highlighted here in red, with rough pineapple-like skins. Finally, the bands of decoration at the base of both lintels use a repeat lobed leaf pattern outlined here in yellow. Beyond the lintel, both doors are carved with baluster columns, an architectural motif which Ebba Koch defines through 4 primary elements: a base, a shaft, a capital, and a pot-like motif. These elements are more clearly defined in Bargash's door, where we can easily read the simple base, the fluted column, a Corinthian-esque capital, and a decorative pot from which sprouts a scrolling plant. Although still legible as a baluster column, Tipu Tip's door further elaborates this form by repeating the vegetal scroll both above and below the pot. The comparison between these doors is further solidified by their proximal and chronological relationships. Each is situated on the stone town mansion of its respective owner, located approximately a 5-minute walk from each other, and so those 2 locations are starred here on this map. Sultan Bargash's door features on Beit al-Ajaib, a 4-story beachfront palace, one of the more recognizable features of Zanzibar's coastline. And so you can see a close-up of that on the left-hand image, and then on the right-hand image, you can see kind of a further away shot here. And you can see that it is a really definable feature. It's the tallest building on the coast, on this particular coast. And so, built in 1883, Bargash's monument precedes Tipu Tip's residence by just 8 years. Though not built on the scale of Bargash's residence, Tipu Tip's residence and door suggest clear affinities with Sultan Bargash, affinities which Tipu Tip repeatedly conveyed in his later life. In his memoirs, first published in 1902, Tipu Tip mentions Sultan Bargash beginning from the 4th page of the 1st installment, despite not meeting him in person until the 19th page of the 2nd installment of these memoirs. And so that's the 1st installment is on the left, or the first instance in which he's mentioned is on the left, and when they finally meet is on the right. The first mention of Bargash merely details the familial conflict for the sultanate fought between Sultan Bargash and his brother Majid, but countless subsequent references to Bargash reinforce the ongoing economic and social relationship between these 2 figures. This excerpt from page 1 of the 2nd installment, seen here in the middle, of Tipu Tip's memoirs indicates the close relationship between the 2, despite still not having met in person. So much so that Tipu Tip can ask for valuable and rare commodities such as gunpowder from Bargash, and Bargash was quick to comply with this request. Tipu Tip clearly wanted to convey the mutual relationship he shared with one of the most powerful figures on the Swahili coast. And this relationship was predicated on particular expressions of power. This passage has Tipu Tip requesting gunpowder from Bargash, which he presumably uses in the war he subsequently wages against Sultan Kasanora of Uvinza, a city near Lake Tanganyika in present-day Tanzania. Tipu Tip sought to hunt for ivory and capture enslaved peoples unencumbered by any limits set by local rulers. The businesses that enabled him to build his lavish mansion and accompanying door in Zanzibar were expressly violent ones. And these were businesses from which both Tipu Tip and Bargash benefited. This violence associated with Tipu Tip and Bargash and with their material legacies carries on in various capacities today. One of the most enduring rumors associated with Bargash's door is that Bargash had the artisan's hands removed upon its completion so that he could never make such a door again. This story plays on tropes circulating throughout Afro-Eurasia in which ungrateful patrons have architects killed after the completion of a project, perhaps the most famous being that of Sinimar, a Greek architect who was killed by King Naumann after Sinimar had completed work on the Hawarnak Palace. Whatever the basis for this rumor, questions over the truth of such claims pale in comparison to the very real fear associated with wealth and royal commissions that has left an enduring legacy throughout East Africa. Rita Meyer has explored similar rumors about the nature of commissioning and constructing stone mansions in Zanzibar and Mombasa. She's noted that, according to locals, Hamad Bin Ahmed, the last Zanzibari ruler with any significant authority, interred dozens of enslaved Africans in the walls of his palace at Dunga to protect it from outside aggressors. Similar stories are associated with the construction of the Peace Memorial Museum, whose story I discussed at the beginning. In her study of the museum, Sarah Longair noted that the collapse of one of the walls during construction resulted in the deaths of several workers. Clearly, there is an ongoing relationship between elite or imperial commissions and devastating violence. Of course, the material presented so far represents carefully selected doors about which histories of production and display are better, if not entirely known. But the vast majority of this object type have had their histories erased, whether intentionally or accidentally. Especially during the 1970s and 1980s, countless carved doors were removed from houses through sale by owners and through looting by relic hunters. During this kind of mass exodus of doors, few were labeled with the names of former owners or the locations to which they were attached. This process was further exacerbated by scholarship that did not prioritize studying the doors as part of wider social, architectural, and political networks. Indeed, as one of the earliest studies focused on these doors, James DeVere Allen's 1971 article on Swahili ornament makes no reference to specific artists, patrons, or locales. Instead, he prioritized the decontextualization of motifs and styles in order to make claims about the origins of wood carving on the Swahili coast, although how these claims make any sense without context is questionable at best. Allen's research in Kenya in the 1970s was shaped by post-colonial and nationalist discourses that sought to resituate the histories and material cultures of the Swahili coast as specifically African. This was in response to colonial discourses such as L.W. Hollingsworth, A Short History of the East Coast of Africa, that argued for Arab and Persian satellite states giving rise to modern Swahili culture. Allen's work on these doors and other objects produced and used in East Africa reshaped histories in this region that had previously disassociated Africans from their cultural heritages. But at the same time that these concepts surrounding these doors were being situated in East Africa, the physical objects themselves were being removed en masse. This was a process in which Allen was intimately involved. A number of these doors, now in Western collections, were either sold by Allen or earmarked by him for sale to foreign collections. For instance, several door carvings now held at the Fowler Museum were purchased by American collector Jerome Joss from James DeVere Allen shortly before Allen's death in 1990. The exact circumstances surrounding how Allen first acquired these objects is not known, but it is important to note the paternalistic nature of Allen's interest in preserving the material culture of coastal East Africa. Indeed, when selling part of his photographic archive to the Aga Khan Documentation Center in 1988, he confessed to Mark Horton that he was unwilling to entrust his negatives to anyone else here in Kenya, despite having founded the Lamu branch of the National Museums of Kenya, which presumably would have some sense of how to preserve objects and archives. The paradox between Allen's desire to claim the Swahili coast for Africans and yet at the same time to see them as unfit to preserve their own material culture is laughable. I don't wish to wholly disparage Allen's research and process, but rather to emphasize that precise histories were seldom sought in these post-colonial studies on Swahili coast carved doors. Historians were pursuing particular agendas, and those agendas seldom left room for historical context. Instead, doors were used in the framing and understanding of ethno-linguistic groups on the coast rather than objects of study in their own right. And I think time is running short now, so I'll conclude by stating that these doors have been used and reused in various capacities throughout the last 3 centuries. They have mediated shifts in leadership, framed violent rises to power, and they continue to moderate Euro-American perceptions of Swahili identity. Their various uses and displays show how powerful these objects are, not only in East Africa, but also globally, in constructing individual and group identities often predicated on power and exclusion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Now, I'd like to introduce to you Jafar Sharif Pokanali, a PhD candidate at the Department of Asian and Islamic Art History at the University of Bonn in Germany, whose dissertation focuses on Islamic arts of Muslim communities of the South Indian littorals. And he will be talking today about the arts of littoral Islam through the porches of mosques in the southern coasts of India. Please.
It is such a great honor to be part of this event. Thank you very much. This presentation I have divided 4 sections. First, I will talk about littoral Islam, then about the translation model, then the idea of Indic mosque architecture, and then some details about the motifs. The idea of littoral Islam came into being in the wake of an increasing scholarly attention on the coastal Muslim communities who inhabit the coast of the Indian subcontinent and the islands of the Indian Ocean. To answer the question of what is littoral Islam, scholars identify the vernacular literary traditions and distinct architectural pattern as key factors. An important factor being their formation in an environment where maritime trade networks played a crucial role. The agents of religious conversion were not the ruling elite, but itinerant merchant clerics and Sufis. Arabic as a contact language is another shared feature. Although the idea of the littorals were meant to bring more attention to these scattered communities, its distinction has been usually elaborated through certain explanatory models that regard this distinctiveness as folk, passive, or deviant. We have now translation model to look at these formations. Unlike earlier models, this model raises pertinent question of how agents of Islamic cultural production sought a range of conceptual and terminological equivalences from Indic tradition to convey Islamic ideas. Scholars who use this model are concerned with the question of how Islamic and Indic conventions, idioms, and motifs are woven together in this deep process of translation. In this discourse of translation, the idea of bricolage is used as a metaphor for transformation of science as well as for ingenuity implicated in the process of translation. Here, the idea of bricolage can be understood as a creative technique of appropriations from already existing science, which the agents of production employ it by using the available materials, form, idioms, and motifs to make a new admixture. My discussion in this paper is limited to South Indian littoral Islam. I have framed this discussion as a movement from outside of the mosque to its inside. While engaging with the architectural form of this mosque, scholars usually focus on its external resemblance to the local Hindu temples. Here, the problem of its ambivalent position within the category of mosque architecture is resolved through the top of syncretism. The architectural form of the littoral mosque, with its lack of minarets and domes and its unique spatial layout, to be analyzed within the architectural convention of Indic mosque found along the coast and the islands of the Indian Ocean. In her study on the Indian Ocean mosque, Elizabeth Lembon identifies porticos and antechambers in front of the prayer hall, which according to her create an intermediary transitional space between the prayer hall and the exterior of the mosque. She says, this is truly pan-Indian feature and mentioned that porticos and antechambers are difficult to locate within the vocabularies of Islamic architecture. However, this spatial organization of the mosque can easily be connected to Indian ritual space, and this she identifies as Indic mosque architecture. Moreover, the structural principle of the regional mosque often consists of a stone foundation, which we call adisthana. Stone walls, wooden columns, upper story, and sloped roofs. This is adisthana. Lembon's placing of this intermediate transitional space as an appropriation from the temple architecture doesn't solve the problem of seeing the Muslim cultural production through Hindu templates. Something which can be identified with Indic can also be Islamic. But she identifies this spatial organization as essentially originally Indic ritual space, and then she corroborates its replication in the Indian mosque architecture. However, the traditional popular house on the Malabar coast also contains an eye-shaped rectangular layout that has a circumferential expansion around the core in the form of veranda. Furthermore, this spatial organization is not essentially limited to the either Indic or Islamic context. He observed in Shukuhi's study, he observed that antechambers in front of prayer hall can be traced back to early Muslim settlers of South Asia to the coast of Yemen. It shows that it is a broader Indian Ocean convention, not essentially related to Indic sacred specialities. Moving to the inside of the mosque from form to other architectural and artistic aspects such as monumental epigraphy, images, and motifs to be seen inside, dominant scholarly discourses usually regard its Islamicness as a thin ornamental, a Islamic veneer. This need to be looked at more clearly and problematized. While studying the Muslims of the South Indian coast, scholars usually focus on Muslim material heritage of the coastal emporiums and the Muslim architectural heritage since the disruption caused by the Portuguese incursion in the Indian Ocean is generally missed. Although a detailed mapping of this interior of this mosque is beyond the scope of this paper, I would nevertheless like to place my materials through these three sequential historical processes in order to understand the constitutive relationship went into the making of bricolage forms and its variation in the littorals, namely disruption, displacement, and transformation. The discussion in this paper about early modern discontinuity and change that can be seen in the material and visual culture of littoral mosque is limited to few examples. The choices being quite random across a long historical period. The examples are, however, all drawn from mosques that were built using the conventional architectural idioms of the region with a similar spatial layout. In his description of an old mosque in Kollam of southwest India, as an early medieval port city, Shukuhi identified a marble panel with Quranic inscription in an elegant Thuluth script in the style of 13th or early 14th century, which he compares to the style of carving and form of the panel with Gujarati tombstones of the 14th and 15th century. Similarly, you can see the mihrab motif with the lamp, which is also widely circulated as an Islamic idiom. According to Shukuhi, the marble panel was probably brought from Gujarat, which was widespread practice of the period. And such panels were in circulation through the Indian Ocean networks. Similarly, in his discussion of Jamia Mosque, Calicut, another medieval city. Shukuhi observed that the wooden inscription on lintel placed on the entrance wall of the main prayer hall is in an elongated overlapping Nesci script carved in relief with large bold letters. The polished calligraphy indicates that it must have been written by a professional calligrapher with a good knowledge of Arab, perhaps an Arab himself. The corpus of material from these medieval mosques suggests that the agency of foreign Muslims, Paradesi Muslims, were pertinent to their production, and Islamic idioms such as calligraphy were very conventional and of fine quality. Moreover, the Indic motifs such as the lotus are to be found only very rarely. The medieval mosque on the Malabar coast contain Islamic idioms from the Central Islamic region, which makes the visual and material culture of this mosque distinctive, especially when we compare to the later early modern mosque, which diverged in its motif by incorporating new Indic elements and stylistic changes in the Islamic idioms. The divergence can be seen in the transition from the medieval to early modern and later periods, which can be connected to the arrival of Europeans and the disruption of existing trade networks in which the Paradesi Muslims had played a dominant role. From the beginning of the 16th century, the Portuguese began to threaten this domination and eventually reoriented the local power dynamics as well as the composition of the Muslim population. The Paradesi Muslims began to leave the coast, and the local Muslims benefited from this displacement. Moreover, there was an inward movement of the local Muslims into the more interland, seeking new occupational means such as agriculture. It is at this juncture that vernacular literary culture began to proliferate, with writing in Arabic Malayalam or in Arabic Tamil, which is a modified Arabic script for the language of Malayalam or Tamil, in which the local religious scholars assumed their role in the production of ilm or Islamic knowledge. Unlike the late medieval mosque seen on the coastline, within the interland mosque, vernacular Arabic script was used to convey historical and religious knowledge, along with the established use of Arabic as a language of monumental epigraphy. Here, the new local Arabic script did not fit into the existing taxonomy such as Thuluth or Nesci, thereby inaugurating a new style of monumental epigraphy. The new agent of Islamic architecture appropriated and reused idioms and forms from medieval Islamic convention. However, they are not simply borrowing the forms. There is a creative transformation in the form itself. For instance, Sufi ship motif found in the classical Islamic literature underwent a creative transformation in the hands of the new artists and scholars. As an example of the eclectic choices of these new agents of Islam on the coast is a circumnavigating fully rigged European ship image is painted on the
wall of an 18th century Malabar mosque as a symbol of a Muslim journeyman who sails through seas of this worldly life with its trials and temptations. In fact, ship as a Quranic motif is favored in the regional Sufi text, primarily because of its resonance to the literal context of these communities. Here the five masks represent 5 pillars of Islam and 6 floors of ship represent the 6 articles of the faith. And each technical features of the imagery have its equivalents to the Islamic mystical ideas. Similarly, we can see more rare figural images and motifs that part of local Indic cosmology, such as snake or naga or three creatures makara. These apotropaic figures merge with verses of or phrases from the Quran and Hadith and may have been employed as a supplication for protection. Similar to Malabar Mosque, during the same period, the mosque in the Coromandel region also underwent similar changes, and one important feature of this period is the use of composite columns. Prominent in Nayaka period but without accompanying figural images. Similarly, the use of Islamic visual references on these columns, such as the miniature domes and Islamic arches, point to the fact that sculptors of these composite columns were aware of their choices. They appropriated local idiom Indic features such like Pushpapodiga, the flower bud bracket capital that stand for auspiciousness. Similarly, the exterior and interior walls of the mosque in Kelakkarai in Tamil Nadu features empty niches, Devakosta of Hindu temples of the region. Compared to the Malabar Mosque, the mosque in Coromandel Coast do not have elaborate monumental epigraphy but at a minimal level. In brief, this early modern improvisation of Islamic arts of the littoral mosque in South India relied a network of local kings, landlord, vernacular scholars, local workmanship, a local community of believers as patrons. The material culture of these mosques was a result of their collaboration, which can be characterized as an intellectually astute process of sitting and thinking together. The intrusion of Europeans into the Western Indian Ocean had a huge impact on the littoral mosque of South India. This was not only an age of conflict, as essentialized by conventional historiography of the local Muslims of the period, but also an age of artistic creativity. To conclude, while projecting them as an embodiment of communal harmony, we are limiting their potential to be represented in many other ways. This requires us to complicate the narrative about Islamic art of the littoral Islam and to reiterate that it is not merely a thin ornamental layer. The historiography of Islamic art that focuses on the early modern period needs to be due accord to this change and transformation to pit artistic creativity and improvisation against alterity and assumed stagnancy. Through the metaphor of bricolage, the creative and collaborative agency of its producers is more visible than ever. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our speakers. At this time, I'm just going to ask all the speakers to come up here, and we will open things up to questions and discussion from all of you in the audience. We're running a little bit behind, and we started a little bit late, but I think we should still have about 20, 25 minutes since our next engagement is just sort of snacks. So I'll make sure I don't keep us away from that for too long, but I think we can do about 25 minutes. While you're all formulating your questions, I'll just sort of take the prerogative of asking the first one. Rita, some fantastic images there, and I think it's really obvious in certain ways to come to questions about shared and appropriated iconography and certain kinds of aesthetic modes. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about, instead or in collaboration, about technology. And what I'm thinking of is just what the meanings of oil paint itself might be in a Tunisian context in this 19th century moment.
Yeah, it's working. I'm sorry. Actually, yes, this question is very interesting because one of the aspects of the study is trying to figure out the relationship between oil painting and different other kinds of painting that existed at that time in Tunisia. Because I didn't mention that what I presented today was the introduction of oil painting, even if the introduction was probably earlier, but according to the artworks we have in the collections of Tunisia. But at the same time, there was a local tradition of painting, wall paintings. There were a tradition on glass paintings, which were developed, popular, introduced through from the Ottoman Empire. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you have this Tunisian local oil painting. I think it's a very important distinction because it's not the same painter, artist versus or in opposition or besides craftsmen who are producing these paintings. There is also the monumentality of the canvas painting, and as you saw in the pictures in the slides I show, they are all monumental. I think there is the question of realism, there is the question of monumentality, and also it's the technique that allows this new art in the court of Tunis. And this is a very important distinction between the Bey himself and other members of the court, and also the local population.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Question for Jenny. Has any of the wood been identified? I mean, is it imported teak or is it African?
Is it on? Yeah. Okay.
It is.
There's a mixture. There definitely is teak coming in, especially during the second half of the 19th century. But there's also a lot of local wood being used, and I'm forgetting the particular name, but it's a similar local hardwood that's sourced primarily from mainland Tanzania and Kenya.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question for Rita Mooney. Do you have information about the training of court painters in mid-19th century Tunisia?
Can you repeat? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
She asked if there was information about the training of court painters.
Actually, it's also a very interesting question. There are different kind of painters. There are many of them who were so-called. I'm not going to speak directly about Monnier, who did this painting of Sadaq Bey putting his hands on the Constitution, but there are a lot of accounts speaking about Italian, Maltese painter traveling not only in Tunisia but also in North Africa and the Mediterranean, and they were proposing their services to the Bey and members of the court. There were also French painters, so-called Orientalists, traveling, proposing their service also for miniatures, portraits also on watches or on tobacco box, which were very popular at that time in the 19th century. Some of them, when Ahmed Bey, in the series of reform he made in Tunisia in the middle of the 19th century, he created the first school called l'École Polytechnique, the military school of Tunis in 1840. Several members of this school, professors, directors, were introduced themselves as artists and did also drawings. And one of the main teaching in the military school was drawing, probably to do later topography or something like that. But in the accounts, in the archives, we have several books commissioned for the school, including a book on the art of drawing. And this is very interesting because one of the theory that I try to that I developed, but it's not a very it's not my personal theory because it's something similar that happens in other Arab countries. The first Tunisian artists went to this military school, and their training was going to the military school, acquiring the art of drawing, and then later, which is the case of the first very well-known Tunisian painter, Ahmed Osman, then later go to Italy to perform his art and then come back to Tunisia. So there are different categories of painters, and we could document their training from the middle of the 19th century. But basically, for Wenya, and for the case of Tunisian, it goes through the military school in Tunis.
I just had a really quick question for Sarah. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was curious if you felt that the difference between the step wells that you'd shown and the cistern coming in was related to the system of construction in terms of, post and lintel being what is used for most of the step wells, and then sort of the arcuated introduction, in the construction. Did you find that that was also sort of a turning point in terms of using those kind of cisterns?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood your question.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the step wells, most of them use the post and lintel system of construction, whereas the cistern that you were showing was arcuated. And I was wondering if that was, one of the reasons or one of the things that you saw as one of the features you saw as sort of the difference between using cisterns of that type, of that construction, as opposed to the post and lintel system that was already in use before.
Yeah, it's a very relevant question because it's one of the main technological difference between the Indic architecture, which was implemented by the Maharajas and then the Sultans of Gujarat, and the architecture which developed in the course of the Islamicization of the architecture in Western India. But there are other cases of monuments with arches and vaults before this system. So I would not say that the system introduced the arch in Gujarat, but
yeah, okay, I understand. I wasn't asking that. I was just wondering if you felt that there was a change between the two different systems in storing water, that cistern itself was coming from, an arcuated background.
Yeah. It's actually bringing a very different relationship to water, and the whole ecology to water is changing, and the water was accessible, and it was also part of the urban landscape. It was actually the whole city was having this huge waterscape with not just the tanks as I showed, but also huge lakes and the step wells. So it was really part of the life. And that's actually what I'm really interested in and looking at, is how the local population could adapt to this change of ecology and this change of landscape. And I was actually looking at the reason why people accepted the system in spite of this change of ecology. And there are military reasons, there are different reasons why people started building these systems, because this is a time where the siege developed, so they had to have their own autonomous ways of accessing water within the city. So it was actually needed, and people had to build their own system to survive in the city. It was not, so it was a forceful introduction either way, and it was not an easy shift. But they introduced new religious practices which allowed them to cope up with this new way of dealing with water.
Thank you very much.
Down front.
Thank you to the entire panel for your excellent papers. And I have a question for both Sarah and Jenny. I'll go with Jenny first. Thank you so much for your important and provocative reminder of the complex relationship between violence and art in the Indian Ocean. And I wanted to ask you just to talk a little bit further about another, of course, important recontextualization of the so-called Swahili door type, and that is, of course, its museification. That is how it exists in museum collections, and the kinds of stories it's forced to tell as a fragment to represent, a particular story. If you could speak to that. And Sarah, I wanted to ask you, since you told us these wonderful ways that Islamic silver had many afterlives in the Scandinavian context, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more if there is an active sort of awakening or another contemporary afterlife of Islamic coins and silverware in contemporary Scandinavian museums, and how they try to narrate the connections between Vikings and the Muslim world. Thank you.
Sure, I can go. So in regards to...
Oh, sorry, yes, Holly.
In regards to the museumification of the doors, and that's sort of kind of a tangent that I need to push further in terms of my discussion of James DeVere Allen and sort of the use of doors as ethnographic objects, and because they really, I think in the 20th century, become the ethnographic object par excellence of the Swahili coast in terms of like identifying kind of a Swahili coast culture as though there was ever any kind of singular one, and that culture, so to speak, is very rooted in an Arab tradition that has connections to Africa, but is still somehow kind of distinct from the continent. And I think one of the other kind of tangents you can take that as well is, I was actually talking to someone about doors recently, and there's sort of a way in which they're reused, that they're constantly used as doors whenever they're spoliated, and so that kind of one that it's at the Peace Memorial Museum, it's constantly being shifted, but it still always functions as a door. But the second they're brought into a museum context, they're often broken down, so you have a lintel or a doorpost, and actually the lintel I showed from the Fowler Museum, at least in its in the catalog online, the way it's displayed is on its side. So like it can't even visually function as a door anymore because it like is rotated in a way that wouldn't make sense for it to function. And so there's this weird thing that's happening in which they're understood as doors, and they're used very kind of purposefully on the like in kind of Euro-American collections to talk about identity and kind of identity politics on the coast. But then they're also just like non-functional in like any even kind of visual theoretical capacity.
Thank you for your question. I didn't think about this in the paper at all, but the museum context for these objects is sort of maybe why I'm working on this as a secondary project. I should say I'm a Fatimid specialist. This is not my dissertation work, but I studied as a Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse as a master's student. I studied these languages. So I had this sort of odd sort of interest and background information. But for example, in the Viking World catalog that I think the British Museum produced, these catalogs don't identify the material beyond the term Islamic usually. And so it's difficult because usually if you're a Viking specialist, you know, you're not going to be trained in Islamic material. And as an Islamicist, you're not really trained in Old Norse to deal with like the sagas and things like that. So museums display these items and say, oh, look, contact with the Islamic world, but what is the Islamic world, right? Like, what does that word mean? And I also think sort of how the objects have been worked with in this modern museum context to figure out some of these coins, though, in particular objects where the coins are sort of mutilated. It's, you know, we'd have to sort of take the coin apart, sort of bend it back over the silver to figure out which coin it is or something like that. So these are just things that we're not willing to do, to destroy an object to figure out something like that. Yeah, it's an interesting question for sure.
I had a question for Holly as well. I know we've had evidence of Viking families having not just trade and contact, but intermarriage with Islamic Spain. So for instance, we have a series of objects that have ended up in northern Spain as part of those marital ties. And it was interesting to me that you said so many of these objects are actually found in women's burials rather than men's. So is there any evidence of, I'm sorry if this is, since this is not your dissertation topic, you might not have the answer for this, but is there any evidence of intermarriage as well as collecting between the Samanids and the Vikings?
The quick answer is not that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean that it's not possible, but when I'm reading these Arabic sources, we're talking about Muslims, merchants, traders, people who are or people who are sent on sort of missions to sort of go, convert other folks. So the diaries or the journals, the travel writings, whatever you like to call them, they sort of tell this story of the trade, and they're very interested in Viking women. But there's very little indication that like Samanid women are really making this journey, right? This is mostly, like I said, these sort of merchants or traders who are sent on these. But I haven't come across sort of Viking sort of intermarriage with the Samanids. Again, not to say it's not possible.
Well, and even vice versa, because again, it was the Viking women coming to Spain, so Viking women coming to the Samanids. But
I mean, this trade, it's interesting. They sort of, if you really look at a map, it's a telling sort of thing to do, because you can see where Vikings are coming from these north countries down to the Volga, and Samanids are then coming up, right? And so, again, not to say it's not possible, but so far the evidence is mostly that these merchants were really interested in the sort of sexuality of these Viking women, or rather slaves is what we should be calling them, in these sort of trade contexts. But this is something really to look into for sure. So thank you for that.
If I just make a comment, I think what you've all shown very well is something about contact and crossover. Contact and crossover, it was an article I read some time ago, a long time ago, and I can't remember where. But what it shows really is that contact between cultures, between different traditions can initiate something new. And in Holly's case, for example, this was the reappropriation of objects that, coins, circulation of currency, but to become something that is amuletic. In your case, it's the different tradition of the representation of royal imagery, really, between contact of Arab culture and European culture. To put it very simply, Hinduism and Islam in southern India. The doors, objects that have traveled. I mean, I'd be very interested, for example, to know about doors in Bahrain and also in India, and where they've all ended up. I mean, they've ended up everywhere, and they've become incredible sort of style objects now, I think. I've seen them in Kuwait, for example, in houses. And, what you showed also, in terms of architecture. So I think contact and crossover contact is a very powerful thing, and what results is something new. Now, I have a comment, rather question perhaps, or / comment for Holly. I wonder if you've thought about the very famous, of course, textile, the Sphère de Saint-Josse in the Louvre, in the name of the Samanid governor Abu Mansur Boktakin, which also, of course, Samanid object, ended up in a church in France by intermediation of a Norman prince, and it was then used to bury the remains of a saint. So again, a reappropriation, and quite in a sense, I mean, it's not too dissimilar, in fact. Of course, we don't know if this textile was chosen as a amuletic object. We don't know that. But certainly it had a significant meaning in order to be used for this particular context. And I mean, just think of the many grave textiles that I've worked on, also reappropriation. But I think, you know, there's an interesting sort of parallelism there between that textile and your coins.
I think that that's true, that there's a sort of larger story here of the afterlife of salmonid material. I would probably argue, though, all the material in the Islamic world gets sort of, a lot of it, right, gets sort of moved into different contexts. There's something that folks want with it. But this is a great point to make, that this idea of a textile, there probably is a much larger project with sort of the afterlife kind of concept. Thank you for that.
Just would like to add something because it really makes sense, and I think it's helpful for all of us what you just mentioned about the new part. And I think this meeting of different influences and ideas and contexts, it's really the space for new things to start and develop. And if I look at the architecture in India, actually the people who were building and working in the architectural field, they were very much restricted to the ancient tradition of building. They had to follow the treaties, and it was a bliss for them that people asked them for something new and asked them to rethink their architecture, and they had their stock of knowledge. They are the craftsmen, they are people who knew how to carve stone and how to carve wood, but they missed this opportunity to rethink the architecture and to have a space for creativity.
Regarding your mention about codatent change, I want to add that the idea of circulation and network, that when things and objects, people move through networks and circulation, so it ends up a kind of like there will be a process of transformation. What at one point of level, it may end up differently and deformed. That increment is added in the process of this translation. While we focus on that aspect, it may be more advantageous.
My question is for Rita. Fascinating topic. Thank you very much for sharing your findings. You talked about the dialogue, the interaction between Europe and Tunisia. Are you also considering other centers in the region like Istanbul? Because the monumental paintings that you showed resemble, very much Mahmud II's portraits. Are there any interactions between these two sites? Because, most of the time this is what we do, Europe and the rest, but interactions are taking place between, different centers, and they're looking at each other. I'm assuming you're also looking at that. I'd like to know what interactions you found.
Thank you for your question. It's actually a question that I hear a lot, especially last year I was fellow at the Aga Khan Center, so Gurun Nishipoglu was always trying to push me that way, which I do. Istanbul was a very important center, but what I show and showed in the past is what the Bey of Tunis, through his new policy, was to develop. There was a very, very important dynamic to establish contact not only with France, but very different kingdoms in Europe. He was sending ambassadors all over Europe to establish contacts, to exchange gifts, including portraits. He sends portraits to Sweden, to Germany, some other representing embassies, Tunisian embassies in Belgium, etc. And what is interesting is he wanted to create a new narrative for his power, because what is interesting is with this rise and the development of this new art of portraiture in the royal court of Tunis, the Bey was allowed for the first time to create his own narrative, and it went through diplomatic relationship, new relationships with new countries, And also at that time, Tunisia had an important revolution, so a civil war inside the country. So they created the narrative also through the heroization of different generals or the Bey himself. Istanbul always remained an important center of power, and there were exchange. When they were sending embassies in Europe, at the same time, they were sending also embassies to Istanbul to say, no, what's happening in Europe is not very important. We are still vassals of the Sultan in Istanbul, etc. So they were exchanged. But the nature of the gifts of the art exchange with Istanbul was very different. In Istanbul, the Sultan usually liked diamonds. So when you go through the archives, what you find is swords with diamonds, horses, like a lot sent from Tunis because they are considered the Arabic stallion from Tunisia has a very important reputation, saddles, gold, money. That is the nature of the exchange. And I went through the archives also to see what were the gifts sent to Istanbul or received from Istanbul. There wasn't a lot of exchange of portraiture. But what is interesting is when you see the exchange from Istanbul to Paris or other countries of the region, Tunisia has the same development, the same phenomenon of development of painting and artistic exchange with Paris. It seems like it goes to Paris and come back to Tunis. It's the same thing also in Egypt, Istanbul, etc. It usually goes to Europe and come back from Europe for this new art, new technology, and these artistic interaction. And when you go to south from south, it's mainly about money. It's mainly about a different kind of material culture, and that's the case. That's the case of Tunisia. I'm wrong because at the 19th century the exchange with Egypt is different, and there is a lot of artistic exchange, which is different with North Africa and mainly with Tunisia.
Okay. Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah. So I think Avenel, I'm down front.
Thank you. I'm just thinking now, you know, when Jochen brought the whole breadth of all the questions that might be asked to all of you, I'm just thinking that if we are putting our hand on the idea of mobility as a kind of an ethos now in art history, as if each object can have 100 worlds in it, and I'm trying to, you know, paraphrase McGregor, but I'm thinking, are we already away from the idea of the beginning of the travel of the object, the place where it was made, and the place when it reached to? What's happened on the way? What's happened on the way to the objects? And I think that I felt that Jafar was trying to struggle with that, with a kind of another approach, that the object is not only objet trouvé, that has been just found and been used. You know, I'm thinking of the change that the object might have gone in the way, in that the moment it reached the other place, it is not anymore the object it was when it was made even. This kind of a change is going to take us to the roots in between the two places, and then by the end, to go away also from the model of a center, power, and the other place when it was made. That will take us to Tunisia, for example. Do we have always to go to Paris or to Istanbul? And if we go, how can we avoid the idea of a power in that context? It's things that came to my mind. I'm sorry, I'm just reflecting on things that were said here about the mobility. Thank you.
Jafar, did you want to jump in on that?
I have already mentioned about mobility and transformations. So I use this approach of translation, mainly it has many limitations. But to address this change, like there is a process of cognitive filters, like those who behind this production in the early modern period in my region, like the workers, they were mainly from different ethnic backgrounds. So they sat together, then it's visible through the visual language of the mosque. So what I think is like a kind of cognitive filtration happens, and bending and changing of the what is already existing, something this. Then there is also a kind of process that the signifier and signified, that relationship is also a kind of deconstruction is happened in these cognitive filters. In that way, we can address these value additions. What happens, things move through networks and circulations. I think apart from that, this framework has limitation to address other dimensions of the objects, like relic objects, which often I come across in shrines and all. So I have to address the materiality of these objects, not only of the language, especially while reading from other angles, like relics.
Thank you. All right. I hope all of you will join me in thanking our speakers once again. And we can continue all of these conversations over cookies, which we don't want to keep waiting any longer. So we'll just be out that way.
Thank you.
Oh,
sorry, just a couple of announcements before you take off. For tomorrow and the following day's panels, all the speakers, we request you to sit in the front 2 rows so the rest of the public can sit behind you. And Marissa, there was one other thing that we were supposed to say. Yes, I'm sorry. Once the panels are done and we get into the question and answer part, to have all the speakers sit left to right based on the sequence of their presentation. Okay, thank you. And now what Sean said.